welcome to the March 2nd edition of Global Nashville with Karl Dean. I'm Patrick Ryan, founding president of the Tennessee World Affairs Council. Let me start again with a program note. The next episode of Global Nashville will be on Thursday, March 18th instead of Tuesday that week. Mayor Dean's guest will be Senator Bob Corker, former chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. They'll be talking about the international challenges facing the United States and the impact of global developments on Tennessee. This evening, former Nashville Mayor Karl Dean will talk about the issue of immigration, refugee resettlement, and we'll also talk about the Biden administration's announcement to raise the cap in refugee admissions to the United States from the Trump administration ceiling of 15,000 to 125,000 a year, and what that will mean for Tennessee. To talk about these issues, we're pleased to have with us this evening Louisa Sherman Nikolas, Executive Director, Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, or TIRRC. She is a Guatemalan American whose family made the difficult decision to leave Guatemala and relocate to Nashville in 2001. She joined TIRRC in October 2015 and served as policy director for nearly 5 years before stepping into the role of executive director. We're joined by Isaac James from Memphis. He was born in the Ifo refugee camp in Kenya. Isaac is passionate about creating opportunities to strengthen migrants and refugees' integration in their host communities. He currently serves as an education and care coordinator for Refugee Empowerment Program in Memphis, Tennessee, developing an entrepreneurship program for young immigrants. Also with us is Louisa Saratora. She has worked with refugees in Tennessee for nearly 25 years in direct service, program development, coordination, and grant management and oversight. She currently serves as the state refugee coordinator with the Tennessee Office for Refugees, a Department of Catholic Charities of Tennessee, responsible for the administration of Tennessee's refugee program. You can learn more about our guests and their bios posted to our tnwac.org website. Thank you all for joining us. And now I'll hand over the floor to Mayor Dean.
Thank you, Pat, and welcome to all our guests. We're thrilled to have you here tonight. Talk about this important subject. Lisa, I want to start with you and talk about TIRRC. And I guess I should, in terms of disclosure, say that I'm a supporter of TIRRC. I've been involved in some of TIRRC's efforts, and I think they do great work and important work for our state. So I acknowledge that position on my part. Could you just start and tell us what TIRRC is, how long it's been around, and what is your mission?
Yes, thank you, Mayor Dean, so much for having this important conversation, for all of your amazing work to ensure that Nashville is a welcoming place for all, and that immigrants and refugees are included. Your tenure as mayor was really transformative for our city and really building a more inclusive city where everyone can belong. So we're really grateful for you and your leadership in that. So TIRRC, or the Tennessee Immigrant and Refugee Rights Coalition, was started 17 years ago. It came together when some immigrant and refugee serving organizations and advocates came together to actually pass a driver's license law for undocumented folks here in Tennessee, and they were really successful. It was, of course, later on overturned in subsequent years, but they realized their collective power in coming together and advocating for systems change to better serve immigrants and refugees. And so TIRRC has grown from there, from a staff of 1 to a staff of 21. And we work really to build the next generation of immigrant and refugee leaders here in Tennessee, to empower them to fight for communities where everyone can belong. And we also work with receiving communities to help them understand why it's so important to build these welcoming communities for everyone.
And TIRRC has a significant presence in Nashville, and you're located here in Nashville, but it is a statewide organization.
Yes, we are statewide.
Yeah.
That's right. We are statewide. We serve immigrants and refugees all across the state. It's about 330,000 Tennesseans are foreign born. One thing people don't realize is Tennessee actually has one of the fastest growing immigrant populations in the country. So while our population is still relatively low, immigrants and refugees are increasingly moving here and putting down roots and raising their families here.
And what you have recently, or you've been in the process of building a building. I think TIRRC has been at Casa Asafran, and now you're building the building. Tell our listeners about that, our viewers.
Yes, absolutely. And thanks so much for you and your support of our capital campaign. We are about to move into our new office any day now, hopefully next week. It is located in Antioch, really at the heart of Nashville's immigrant and refugee community. And it was really our dream to be able to have our own home, a community center where immigrants and refugees could come and organize, receive leadership training, where we could provide our services, and really where we could build a powerful movement that would reach all across the state. And we have a soccer field, a playground, and community gardens, and the Louisa Event Center, which is going to be an earned revenue space that we're really excited about to sustain our movement in the years to come.
And that space, the earned revenue area, the community sort of space, that was largely paid for through a contribution from Mike Kerb.
Yes, we're so grateful for his support and the support of so many who've really made this dream possible for us.
And the name comes from his family.
Yes, that's right. His grandmother, who came from Mexico. And so we're just delighted to be able to honor those roots and to be able to pay homage to his grandmother, who really, braved the times to come and move to the US and raise her family, just like so many do today.
Yeah, and I certainly just want to say how much I appreciate Mike and he's been in the right place on this issue for a long time.
Yes.
Can you, what's the difference between its immigration, refugees, what's refugees, immigrants, what's the difference?
Yeah, well, we'll talk about refugees today since that is the main topic. So one of the things folks often don't realize is that refugees are people who are unable or unwilling to return to their home country because of a well-founded fear of persecution due to their religion, their race, their ethnicity. And so refugee status is actually a legal status that's defined by the UN, the UNHCR, and the US government. And so refugees are able to enter the country through the refugee resettlement process and get on a pathway to citizenship. And then immigration more broadly, I would say, the definition of refugee is something that is defined by governments and attorneys, but has been argued more recently to be expanded to include refugees from Central America, where I'm from, who are fleeing gang violence and persecution and other kinds of violence in that part of the world, but are often unable to enter the refugee resettlement program.
And so you came here from Guatemala, and because of threats of violence and fear of personal safety for yourself and your family.
Mm-hmm.
And so refugees, when they're allowed into the country or they're here, what law governs that process? Is it federal law, state law?
Yeah, it's federal law. So the refugee status is part of the Refugee Convention, which is enshrined in federal law. And there's also international law that applies to refugee resettlement. But it's really because our federal government, since World War II, recognized the power and the responsibility to welcoming people who were fleeing persecution and violence. And so it's really a recognition of our highest aspirations as a country and the values that we want to strive for, that we're a beacon of hope for people.
Right, the whole idea of the Statue of Liberty and what it stands for.
Exactly, yeah.
And so when, what has happened in the last 4 or 5 years in terms of refugees being allowed to come to the United States and specifically to Tennessee?
Yeah, the last 4 years have been incredibly devastating for the resettlement program. And I'm happy for Louisa to jump in and share a little bit from her perspective as the office that has been resettling refugees. But, the numbers have decreased steadily over the past few years. The president gets to set, in consultation with Congress, the number of refugees we welcome. And traditionally, we've strived to welcome more than 100,000 refugees per fiscal year. But the previous administration decreased that number to the lowest in the history of our country, which was 15,000 refugees this last session. And so that's had really detrimental consequences, both for refugee families who are waiting to be reunited.
For the entire country?
For the entire country, that's right.
And so how many, is there a pro rata divvying that up amongst 50 states, or how many of that 15,000 would be coming to Tennessee?
Yeah, so Louisa, do you want to answer this one? Give you a chance to chime in.
Yeah, so those numbers are a little bit in flux, but I can tell you that last year with a ceiling of 18,000, Tennessee saw 225 arrivals. So
225 political
through the whole state.
Yeah.
Yeah, so 2016 we were seeing over 2,000, and then last year just 225 across the state.
And so how do refugees get to Nashville? Are there organizations that you've been involved with or are involved with now who actually help on resettlement and help have refugees settle here?
Yeah, go ahead, Louisa.
Yes.
Okay, yes. So, and Isaac, I'm sure can chime in as well, but yes, there are two main funders for refugee services, federal funders. The State Department funds that initial resettlement program. So when we think about folks arriving at the airport and moving into their new apartments and finding their first job, that is that initial resettlement program. National voluntary agencies with local affiliates like Catholic Charities or World Relief Memphis or Bridge in East Tennessee or NICE in Nashville are doing those initial resettlement services. And then the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which is a Department of Health and Human Services at the federal level, funds a lot of the ongoing integration services, medical care, temporary cash and medical benefits, employment services, case management, other kinds of supportive services. So our work is the state administration of those ORR funds, but we partner very closely with the resettlement agencies because that is the connection point for refugees coming into our state. And so we work very closely with them to make sure that refugees are receiving the services that they need and that they are entitled to, and that they're welcomed by refugee communities as well as mainstream neighbors.
So when a refugee arrives in Tennessee, Nashville, there is support. I mean, there's governmental support and nonprofit support that works with government funds to help people settle. I mean, because these are folks who are essentially, when they go through the process, say, you can come here, you're welcome here, we invite you. But that number was over the past administration was lowered and lowered and lowered. And how has that affected the agencies here, Catholic Charities and Nashville World Relief that work with refugee resettlement?
Yeah, it was incredibly devastating. We actually had to close World Relief's office here in Nashville as a result of the drastic cuts in the refugee resettlement program. And that organization had decades of resettling refugees in our city. And so it was really devastating, not only for those folks who lost their employment, but for refugees who lost that connection to the organization that had helped them find the services and support that they needed. And so as we think about rebuilding the program and increasing our numbers, we've lost so much institutional knowledge and experience that it's gonna take some time to rebuild, and is really critically important to ensuring the successful resettlement of refugees.
Yeah. Isaac, how are things in West Tennessee? How's Memphis?
Hi, Mayor Dean, thank you again for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation. As Mr. Ryan said, I was born in IFO refugee camp, and so refugee resettlement has literally given me and my family a new chance at life. Here in Memphis, Tennessee, I work with Refugee Empowerment Program, which is a nonprofit organization that seeks to help refugees integrate into West Tennessee, into Memphis. So the conversation you just had about the impact that lower numbers have on resettlement agencies, when that happens, nonprofits such as Refugee Empowerment Program that don't do resettlement have more refugees to take care of. And so the importance of the refugee settlement program and funding these resettlement agencies is so nonprofits and organizations like World Relief can have the resources needed to provide for the vast majority of refugees, rather than having to have the weight of numerous refugees on just one organization. It's better if resources are expanded throughout various organizations to help with integration.
Is there, for Nashville, for Memphis, Tennessee as a whole, are there particular countries or areas of the world that are most represented in our refugees who are settled here?
Right. So speaking for the refugee empowerment program, a lot of our refugees come from East Africa. So we have refugees from Burundi, from Rwanda, Somalia. And so we have over the years tended to see more refugees coming from East African countries in Memphis than other parts.
Okay. How about Nashville?
Yeah, we've seen, so over the past 10 years, some of our largest refugee populations have come from Burma, Bhutan, Iraq, Somalia. In some recent years, with some of the executive orders that have restricted travel from some of those places, we've seen some of those numbers fluctuate. And then with Burma and Bhutan, those were refugee populations that had lived in camps for long periods of time. And so those programs are starting to wrap up with folks that are eligible to come. The largest population in the last 4 or 5 years has been from the Democratic Republic of Congo, like Isaac mentioned, with East Africa and Central Africa. As well as we're seeing a significant number of folks that come through a program called Special Immigrant Visa Program. And these are folks from Afghanistan and Iraq. We've seen larger numbers of Afghanis recently who have supported our US military or military contractors in conflict zones overseas. And so they are in danger for that relationship with our military forces. And so that's another population that we've seen locally.
Has there been, does TIRRC have an involvement with working with the legislature or lobbying? And what's the status of the of Tennessee politically with welcoming refugees?
Yeah, so, we as a state have a really long and proud history of welcoming refugees since the 1960s, when Catholic Charities first started resettling Cuban political refugees. But unfortunately, since 2011, our state legislature has really gone after the program and refugees, and tried to pass numerous bills to really limit refugee resettlement here and limit the ability of organizations and governments to provide the services that refugees need to be successful. We've, luckily been able to defeat most of those efforts. And most recently, the Supreme Court issued some, not exactly rulings, but rejected the Tennessee legislature's efforts to sue the federal government over refugee resettlement. So we were thrilled about that decision. It was rejected 4 or 5 times by different courts. And most recently, an anti-refugee bill that was introduced this session was withdrawn by the sponsor. And, Governor Lee, we worked with him to ensure that he continued to welcome refugees when President Trump issued an executive order that was going to require states and localities to consent to refugee resettlement, which wasn't a normal part of the process and was really aimed at trying to get states and counties to reject refugees in order to try and curb refugee resettlement in the United States.
So anything going on right now at the legislature that our viewers should be aware of?
So this year, I firmly believe, thanks in large part to our efforts to hold the line and beat back really harmful bills, there are not that many anti-immigrant or anti-refugee bills this year. The same anti-refugee bill that was originally introduced this session, we've seen over the last 2 or 3 years, and we've successfully made sure that it didn't become law. So this year, the sponsor withdrew the bill. And, I give credit to all of us who've been fighting back and making it very difficult to pass these kinds of bills that are really aimed at making Tennessee an unwelcoming place for refugees.
Now, how does COVID the worldwide pandemic affect the refugee numbers and also affect what's going to happen going forward from here?
Mhm. Louisa, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. It has definitely impacted travel. Definitely impacted travel over this past year and continues to some extent. But I think the greatest place where it is impacting is in processing. Just as a lot of us are teleworking, we're not working in buildings, an awful lot of the processing overseas. It's intensive vetting and screening and interviews, and a huge part of that process, nearly all of it really happens in person. Those data systems where we're verifying folks' background checks and doing all of those kinds of screening processes, largely for security reasons, are not accessible remotely. And so a component of the screening process is interviews with USCIS. They have been out of the field for over a year and don't anticipate going back into the field to do new interviews until summer, probably. So folks are doing what they can. They're instituting some pre-screening, some pilot remote screening processes, but that's probably the biggest place right now in terms of looking at growing the program, where it's going to take some time to catch up.
Okay. And so on a good news note, what has President Biden done in terms of refugee numbers?
Yeah, so we're just thrilled. President Biden has raised the refugee ceiling to 125,000 for the next fiscal year, which is really going to be incredible for all the refugee families who've been waiting to be reunited with their husbands, their family members, their aunts, their wives, brothers and sisters. But also his most recent executive order also included many provisions that refugee resettlement advocates have been calling for that bring more humanity and dignity into the resettlement process as a whole. And really, it's been amazing to see and hear the new administration championing refugee resettlement and calling us all in to aspire to living up to the values that we aspire to. So we're just thrilled about being able to welcome refugees again to Tennessee.
So what, this is for anybody, any one of you, if you are talking to a citizen, a fellow citizen, or a legislator, or anyone who says, we don't need any more refugees, or we don't need to increase the number, what's your argument? What's your response to say, wait a minute, think about this? What do you say?
Isaac, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I'll add something there. I would say just look at the impact that refugees are having in their communities. Refugees bring diversity, they bring entrepreneurship, they bring a sense of sort of appreciation of the differences that we have. And I think America is a place where we all recognize our differences and are able to celebrate that. Also, refugees give back to their home communities. So me and my family send remittances back home, which help the local economy in Uganda. And so refugees have both the impact in their host communities, but also back home as well. So refugees, just to wrap up, refugees are individuals that really care about being integrated in America, that really try their best to communicate with different communities, but also bring their intellect, their drive to make their new environments the best possible. And with the new resources and information they gained in America, they always seek to return that back home and empower those in refugee camps back home, but also in their own countries as well.
Anybody, Lisa, Louisa, you want to add anything to that excellent response?
I don't really want to follow Isaac's response there. I mean, I second everything that he's saying. I mean, certainly, I think too, it's not just what refugees bring to us, but an opportunity, like Lisa's been saying as well, for us to live out some of our most important heartfelt values. You know, we are able to welcome folks into our communities. We get to be neighbors. We get to be friends. We get to be teachers and coworkers, and that's an opportunity for us as well. That we are fortunate that folks that are different than us allow us to be a part of their worlds in that way, and to share in a different culture.
Yeah, and it's important, I think, to remember, looking historically, that we have always been a country that has welcomed refugees as part of who we are. But you look at periods of time where we haven't, and we tend to look back at those times with regret, and say we could have done better. We're not living up to our values. Also, I mean, just to differentiate again on some of the immigration issues versus refugees, you're talking about 110,000 people nationwide. This is a number that we easily can absorb. And these are folks who come here where there is a plan. There are organizations that are government funded and some privately funded that are there to provide support and to help. So it's something that works smoothly. I think, is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have one of the best infrastructures for refugee resettlement in the world, and up until the last 4 years had been leading the world in welcoming refugees. I think the other thing people don't realize is there's almost 30 million refugees worldwide, and less than 1% of those actually get resettled to a country like the United States. And so there's a great need in the world, and there's an opportunity, like Louisa said, to welcome folks and give them a second chance at life, and help them raise their families and contribute to our communities, and be part of what makes us so strong and vibrant and diverse. And that's something that you recognized in your administration that we're so grateful, is that diversity really does make us stronger.
Well, I mean, the fact is, these are hardworking people who are looking out for their families. They're resilient, they're resourceful, and they contribute in so many ways to making our country, our states, our cities better. We have a very, I think, a good question. It's very, very specific. Who makes the decision on where to place new refugees, and how is this decision made? This is from Michael, to anyone on the panel.
Louisa?
Sure. That's a great question. One component is absolutely family or friends in the United States. Everyone wants refugees to be successful, and we are most successful when we have support from folks that we know. And so that's always a component of interviewing overseas. And then each of those national voluntary agencies and the local affiliates annually do a very comprehensive assessment of their strengths, community capacity, resources available, other refugee communities that live there, so that folks can be resettled in places in which their needs will be met by the receiving community. So folks that don't have family or friends will be placed in a community that's able to respond to their particular needs.
And a question from Corinne: what are the biggest funding needs as we look to ramp up the state resettlement program as the numbers have gone up?
Louisa, I'll let you speak to that for the agencies, but I would say, you know, from TIRRC and our perspective, one of the things that's going to be really vitally important is that we're building support to welcome refugees. We can't take for granted that people are that people are as excited as we are to welcome refugees. And so it's going to be incredibly important that we are doing the long-term, hard, time-consuming work of changing hearts and minds. And TIRRC's going to be doing that through a new innovative thing called deep canvassing, where we actually go door to door and talk to people about refugees and try and reduce prejudice that way, that we're really excited about. And also by ensuring that people are hearing the positive stories of refugees, and that we're giving them a different narrative than what some local politicians might be giving them about the fear, and that kind of thing. It's going to be really important that we build up that public support.
Good. Pat, do you have any other questions online there that you want to?
Well, Carl, I think we had a lot of good questions. We also have some good comments. Jackie mentions that refugees also take very little resources from the community. By definition, they provide for their own families. They're hardworking, resilient, resourceful, and that's the best description she has. We also have some comments thanking you for your work in the office of the mayor, the new American Advisory Council, and the My City Academy. So tip of the hat to you on that. Jim Polk asks, how can we make clear to the public in the face of cruel attacks that have been made against the prospects for refugees? Are there public education efforts, either locally or nationally, anything that that can be amplified? Lisa, do you want to take that, or
public education efforts on refugee resettlement?
well, on to try to lessen the backlash against refugees?
Yeah, so we're about to embark on a statewide, really exciting deep canvassing effort where we'll be contacting hundreds of voters and engaging in conversation with them for 20 minutes or more in an effort to reduce their prejudice based on the values of compassion and empathy. And this has been a really effective tactic that's been used by, to win marriage equality, to win transgender rights in other parts of the country. And so we're really excited. We'll be the first in the country to apply this specifically to refugees. And we're really excited about that.
Louisa, a question from Greg. He asks can you step back a bit and explain how the Tennessee Office for Refugees is structured, and further explain the historic and current involvement of Catholic charities in resettlement? And where does the funding come from?
Sure. In most states, it is a state office that is responsible for the administration of the refugee program. That was true in Tennessee until about 2007, when it was administered by the State Department of Human Services. At that time, the state decided to withdraw from the program, not because they didn't want Tennessee to participate in resettling refugees, but because the scope of the state's work was so broad that they really felt like the refugee program would be in, they wanted to be in the hands of folks that could really devote their entire energies to refugee programs. And so the Office of Refugee Resettlement, that's a Department of Health and Human Services at the federal office, selected Catholic charities to serve in that role. There's about 15 states nationally in which a nonprofit serves as that statewide administrator. And at that time, Catholic Charities formed a separate department that's responsible for the administration. So we do have a direct services program that does refugee resettlement itself, but we also have an administrative office that is separate that subcontracts with agencies like World Relief in Memphis, like Bridge in East Tennessee, like the Tennessee Language Center for English language instruction, medical clinics across the state to do refugee medical screenings. So the funding comes from the federal government to us, and we subcontract with local providers.
Good. I should read, we have a comment from Jackie Shrego. As our refugee organizations have gotten reduced in size over the years, more have not gotten health care as quickly as they should, refugees. Please note that they should come to Lentz Public Health Center, Metro Center. Also, they could call 615-310-3285 to get health insurance. They are immediately eligible upon arrival. Thank you, Jackie, for that. Well, I think this is a good point for us to, our time is up. So to say thank you to a wonderful panel who do wonderful work, and that we appreciate what you do, and know that, we're proud that you're doing it, and wish you great success. Pat, do you have anything to add?
Well, Karl, we looking at beyond Tennessee at the global situation. As Lisa mentioned, there are some 26 million refugees in the world, and that's out of a population of about 80 million displaced persons around the world. And if you look at the migrant inflow into places like Europe, Germany, with a population of 83 million, has taken in 1 million refugees, mostly from the Middle East, Afghanistan, northern Africa. I don't think it's a I don't think it's a partisan issue to look at this as a humanitarian question, that the United States has a responsibility to do its share to handle those among us on the planet who are in unfortunate situations. So my hat's off to Louisa, Isaac, for the work they're doing, and everyone else who's involved in refugee resettlement. And a hat tip to the new administration for recognizing America's responsibilities.
And congratulations on the building. Maybe we should do a program where we could interview somebody out there and we can have that in the background, and that'd be a good show.
That would be amazing.
Yeah. So again, thank you. And thank you to all the viewers and people who participated. Pat, Senator Corker will be with us on Thursday, the
18th of March, right around the corner, the next edition of Global Nashville. It should be a terrific conversation. He's got lots to share on what's going on in the world. Looking forward to the challenges for the new administration, and also talking about how what's going on in the world impacts Tennessee and Tennesseans.
Right. Okay. Well, thank you all, and thanks to everybody who watched tonight. And we'll see you later.
Everybody have a good evening. Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye.
Ralph Johnson Bunch was an American political scientist, academic, and diplomat who received the 1950 Nobel Peace Prize for his late 1940s mediation in Israel. He was the first African American to be so honored. He was involved in the formation and administration of the United Nations and played a major role in numerous peacekeeping operations sponsored by the UN. In 1963, he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom by President John F. Kennedy. Bunch served on the U.S. delegation to both the Washington Conservations on International Peace and Security Organization in 1944 and the United Nations Conference on International Organization in San Francisco in 1945 that drafted the UN Charter. Bunch served on the American delegation to the first session of the United Nations General Assembly in 1946. He then joined the UN as head of the trusteeship department and began a long series of troubleshooting roles. In 1948, he became an acting mediator for the Middle East, negotiating an armistice between Egypt and Israel. For this success, he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize. He continued to serve at the United Nations, working on crises in the Sinai, the Congo, Yemen, Cyprus, and Bahrain, reporting directly to the UN Secretary General. In 1957, he was promoted to Undersecretary General for Special Political Affairs, having prime responsibility for peacekeeping roles. In 1965, he supervised the ceasefire following the war between India and Pakistan. He retired from the United Nations in 1971. Ralph Bunch. This evening, we'll hear perspectives on developments in Nashville, as well as the 9 years of building a solar energy business that now accounts for over 2 million solar modules installed and almost 400 million kilowatt hours of energy generated. And we'll learn about bringing international businesses to Tennessee, great success stories like Nissan and VW that have contributed to quality jobs in our state and improved our prosperity. Matt Kisber is a co-founder of Silicon Ranch and served as CEO of the company until becoming chairman in July 2019. As chairman, Matt works closely with the company's executive leadership to set and implement its ambitious growth strategy. Under his leadership, Silicon Ranch has become one of the fastest growing developers, owners, and operators of solar energy plants in the US, with a portfolio that includes more than 3 gigawatts of PV systems that are contracted, under construction, or operating coast to coast. Matt brings a unique background to Silicon Ranch, having been a business owner and having served 8 years as Tennessee Commissioner of Economic Development. He has also worked with industry leaders from across the US and around the globe to bring investments and jobs to Tennessee. During his tenure as commissioner, Tennessee received over $33 billion in new capital investment and over 200,000 new jobs. A graduate of Vanderbilt University, Matt served 10 terms in the Tennessee House of Representatives and held numerous leadership positions. Matt grew up in his family's Jackson, Tennessee department store business and developed a great love for the people in the business. He has owned a number of successful small businesses and served as vice president for business development for First Tennessee Bank prior to leading Tennessee's economic development efforts. Matt is married to Paige Kisber, and they have a son who attends Southern Methodist University and a high school daughter who attends Harpeth Hall. He is currently chairman of the Tennessee Business Roundtable, member of the board of directors of the Adventure Science Center, and a founding board member and former chairman of the Tennessee Advanced Energy Business Council. And now, here's Karl Dean and Matt Kisber.
That's good. So you had, because looking at your career where you have spent 18 years plus in public life, in politics, and then you've been involved in the private sector as an entrepreneur. So you've done both. When you got out of college, where did you head?
Well, I graduated in 1982, and I still have a file of rejection letters that I sent, that I received from applications and inquiries I sent to all the names you could imagine. It was the depths of the recession, and nobody was hiring. And so Christmas of my senior year, I was home, and a member of the county commission who'd been a longtime friend of mine was suggesting I ought to run for the legislature. And at first I dismissed it. And he and some other people seriously discussed it with me. And so the more I thought about it, I pondered it. I made, like all good candidates, I said by the end of spring break, I'm going to make my decision as to whether I'm going to run or not. And my father, as I left on spring break my senior year with my buddies, advised me, he said, son, I'm not going to tell you what to do, but the opportunity to be a stockbroker, a lawyer, an investment banker, whatever it is you want to be, may always be there. But the opportunity to run for the legislature, win or lose, probably won't. And so if you run and lose, what have you lost? 6 months, but you've gained a great experience. And if you win, it could change your life. So I took that advice to heart. I ran after graduating in May of '82, I immediately went into the Democratic primary, and I ran that summer against Charles Farmer, who later became the mayor of Jackson, and won the Democratic primary. I think it was 152 votes, and then ran against the Republican incumbent that fall, who was seeking his third term, and defeated him by about 1,400 votes, 52-48, I think it was. And so I started at the ripe old age of 22 on my political journey.
And so you entered the legislature in the early 80s. And at that point, the legislature was Democratic?
It was. Ned McWhirter was the speaker. And I had known Ned both through my father, who he and Ned served on the board of a company, Murray Guard, together. But also, I continued to work for the Jackson Sun while I was at Vanderbilt. That's how I made my money to do the things I wanted to do. And they had a Nashville bureau at the time. And so I worked about 20 hours a week with them. And so when the legislature was in session, I was on the Hill and got to know a large number of the members of the legislature. So when I got elected, I actually started with a little bit of an advantage since especially the rural West Tennessee delegation, knew them well. And I was fortunate to have Ned take me under his wing and mentor me. John Tanner, who later went to Congress, has been a close friend and mentor to me. And John Bragg, who was the chairman of the Finance Committee, took me under his wing. And I had 3 unbelievable mentors as a young man entering the state legislature.
So you were very successful as the legislator. You became the chair of Finance Committee and other powerful committees and a real influence. And then when Governor Bredesen was elected, you moved over to the the executive branch?
So when as I served, I never thought I was going to go and spend as much time at the legislature as I did. I spent 10 terms, 20 years. And some of those last terms were a bit grueling with the budget issues and all. But I got married in 93. And I had committed to Paige that when we decided to start a family, that was it. I was getting out of elected office. And in 2000, our first child came, and I was in the middle of a campaign. So I won that, finished that term, and announced I wouldn't seek re-election. And conveniently for me, it was at the same time that Governor Bredesen was running. I had worked with him as mayor of Nashville on the Dell project, on the Titans Stadium. I'd handled a lot of the legislation around economic development and issues that were of interest to Nashville. And so when he started his campaign, we talked about me being an advisor to the campaign. And so I helped them with issues, political perspective on issues in the state legislature, and was active in his campaign. Both of us had said, now there's no commitment around the job. And I said, I don't want a commitment. He couldn't do one legally. And I said, I'm leaving all my options open. And after he got elected, we talked during that transition period. And he wanted to understand why I had an interest in economic development. And I told him that, I had authored a large number of the tools that are used in economic development. As a business person, I've always loved business strategy, loved how do you compete, and how do you win, how do you differentiate yourself. And so we had a great 2-hour conversation about it. And a few days later, he called me to ask if I would be willing to join his administration as commissioner.
And you had, I think it's fair to say, the Bredesen administration, with your heavy involvement, had lots of success in terms of economic development, but particularly in the area of international investment. What, to you, looking back at it, and a lot of it had a very positive effect on Nashville. When you look back on it, what are the highlights for you?
Well, first you start with a great product to sell. Tennessee is a great product, and there's a lot of work that was done prior to our administration, and I certainly believe that Governor Bredesen contributed to the success of the state. It's interesting. We continue to grow the activities in Japan. Tennessee's an extremely important state, one of the largest for foreign direct investment from Japan. But Governor Bredesen really wanted me to focus on creating new relationships while maintaining and growing the existing relationships. And so during that time, worked to establish a presence in China with the economic importance of that country, and as it was growing, worked to further our presence in Germany, and that was the Volkswagen project, and Wacker Chemie, 2 huge projects to win, both of them in 2008. When I look back and collectively at my 8 years as commissioner, I think that Volkswagen and Wacker, the Nissan headquarters, we had $4 billion plus projects in 2008, the depths of the economic downturn. And everybody was competing for them. And the fact that we won them was extremely impressive. But, we also had over 50 corporate headquarters of some type come to the state. And you and I worked on ones like Service Source and others. Nashville benefited greatly from our emphasis in putting together a toolkit to support the recruitment of projects like corporate headquarters. And the other thing I'll say is Governor Bredesen, when he offered me the job, he said, I want you to understand something. As mayor, I interacted with economic ECD, and it's too political. I want you to hire people based on their skills. I don't care about their politics. And I want you to be effective. and I want you to learn how to listen to what companies need and respond to that, not go and say, here's what we have to offer. How can you make it work? And that was a big part of our success. And he supported our efforts in tailoring our packages and our approaches to specific opportunities. And, you know, he let me put a team together. Lori Odom's a great example. There she is. Lori, I was fortunate to have her on our team. We hired her, promoted her up to International Development Director, and she understood what we wanted to accomplish and went out and did it. And I worked with her on that, and we had a lot of others like that. So I was very fortunate to have great support throughout the administration, especially from the governor, and a great team. And that's how I got to know Reagan Farr, who was the Deputy Commissioner of Revenue and was assigned to work with me on large projects, and who knew at the time he would become my business partner and best friend.
So during this time, I think we were talking before the program started, you visited Japan how many times during this period of your life?
You know, I'd say I probably made over 13. I know I made 13 trips to China. And, you know, when I would go to Asia, I would stop in Japan and whatever other countries we were trying to accomplish, go to China. The China emphasis came about in 2004. And as you recall from participating in and helping to host the Southeast US Japan meeting, every year at that meeting, there is a governors only and economic development commissioner only meeting. And in 2004, we were in Atlanta, and Governor Perdue was talking about all this activity that they were doing in China. And some of the other governors were talking about what they were planning to do in China. And Governor Bredesen, I'll never forget it, leaned over to me and says, "Have you been yet?" And I said, "No, we're actually got a trip scheduled." And he said, "Well, I want you to get over there and I want you to beat them all at what they're trying to do." And in his way, as you well know, he also said, "I don't want the relationship that you establish built on trading dollars for yuan. I want it built on something that's substantive, that is meaningful to both countries. So you need to figure out what that is." And on one of my early trips, it became clear that there was an opportunity for Tennessee and a challenge for China in that they had real problems around rural health care. And so working with the Ministry of Commerce and the Ministry of Health in China, we created an exchange program where they sent rural healthcare leaders, policymakers, and administrators from 6 provinces to Tennessee. And we had worked with Vanderbilt and East Tennessee State and University of Memphis, University of Tennessee, to put together a 3-week program. So they got to see the state, they got to meet various leaders, but they also came to learn about successful rural healthcare strategies. And then the people who presented the next year went to Xi'an, China, and did the same thing for 10 days as they brought people, I think 400 people from all over the country in for that. And the governor was correct about find something that means something to them, because as a result of that, Tennessee was included on so many different trade missions when Chinese buying groups would come to the US. They would go to, New York, Chicago, San Francisco, and they'd come to Nashville, or they'd come to Memphis. And other things took place where we were getting invited into opportunities. And in 2009, I remember being with the minister in the Ministry of Commerce, Beijing, and they reminded me that the Knoxville World's Fair was the first World's Fair that modern China participated in. And they expected Tennessee to be supportive of the Shanghai Expo in 2010. And as a result of their participation in Knoxville, we were a sponsor of the US Pavilion in Shanghai. And they had Tennessee Day, actually a day before USA Day. And we did trade shows and other things around it, but it really elevated the prominence of Tennessee because all these people were focusing on the US on the next day, and they're like, Tennessee is right before. And again, it opened doors and allowed opportunities to be created for the state.
Yeah. And so when the Bredesen administration came to an end, what were your thoughts about what you're going to do next at that point?
Well, around 2008, you had the opportunity to be with Reagan Farr and myself on a number of occasions. He's a very smart, he's a tax lawyer by training, but he's a great strategist and just a smart mind. And he and I had worked together. We said, you know, we need to find something that we can do together. We've been successful in the Bredesen administration. We can take that same skill set and use it in the private sector to do something. And we kicked a lot of ideas around. And as we had worked on developing a green collar job strategy in 2008, 2009, in 2010, we were recruiting companies in the renewable energy component space. Companies like Wacker making polycrystalline silicon, companies like Shoals in Portland, Tennessee that makes components for solar arrays. Sharp in Memphis was making solar panels. And Arison in Chattanooga we recruited them making wind components and others in biofuels and the like. We came to learn that what was going on with solar in Europe and starting to develop on the West Coast was going to be like semiconductors and computers. The price would come down as deployments grew, and it would become a very cost-effective source of electric generation. And Reagan and I kept coming back to the premise, wouldn't it be neat to start a company using the skill sets we've developed and understanding how to differentiate ourselves in an emerging industry where we might be able to even help shape the industry. And so in 2010, Governor Bredesen would periodically ask me, what are you going to do when this gig's up? And I remember saying to him, you know, Governor, when we have it figured out, Reagan and I are working on something, you'll be the first to know. And over dinner, after the Shanghai Expo in May of 2010, we were overnighting in Hong Kong, overlooking Victoria Harbor. We laid out to Governor Bredesen the idea we were kicking around that conceptually became Silicon Ranch. And that dinner lasted about 6 hours. He was very intrigued by it. And he said to us at the end of the night, he said, I think you guys have an interesting idea. I'm willing to be your advisor. Can't let this get in the way of our day jobs. We can meet on the weekends like entrepreneurs do and work on a business plan, and I'll advise you. So over the course of that summer, we did. And in the fall of 2010, the governor said, you know, I think you guys have a really good opportunity here. If you want me to, the three of us will start the company when we leave office. And we agreed to that. And we agreed that Reagan would go ahead and leave state government and work full time on the business plan. And so when the term was up, we had, one of the reasons I stuck around to the very end, we had some projects underway that needed to be completed. And so when the term was up in January of 11, I joined him and we kicked off Silicon Ranch.
And so what's your elevator speech for what Silicon Ranch does?
Absolutely. So Silicon Ranch is a developer, owner, operator of solar generation facilities. And we sell renewable generated electricity to utilities, companies, and the government to help them fulfill both their goals around low cost, sustainable energy, and economic development. So what does that mean? It means that we listen to what a customer wants, we develop a bespoke project to deliver that, and we do that in an extremely cost competitive manner. When we started the company, states like California and North Carolina that had renewable portfolio standards and policy to incent these type projects were where developers were already going. We chose to go where there weren't economic incentives, but you had to compete on cost. And that's why we started in Tennessee, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas. And we were in many of those states, we did the first large solar projects that those states had seen. So we had educated and we worked to fulfill both the energy need, but we also helped them understand how to use it as an economic development tool. And what makes our pitch is Silicon Ranch, we tell a customer, all you got to do is buy the electricity. We do everything else. And it certainly makes it very easy for them. They enter into a long-term contract. We design, construct, build, own, and operate the project.
What's the foreign business side of what Silicon Ranch does? How involved is the international community?
Well, it's interesting because so much of this industry started in Europe. You have a lot of European manufacturers. You also have a lot of European investors. Some of the early investors into solar generation projects were European pension funds. They were some of the early ones also to come over to the US and finance projects when US banks and others were not as educated and interested in financing solar projects. When we got into the business in 2011, the cost to install a watt of solar was around $4. It was extremely expensive. Today, that cost for a large scale project like the ones we do can be as low as 80 cents. And so you can see the cost of building a solar array has come down by about 80%. And that makes the energy cost competitive. Those early days, a lot of the innovation and financing came out of Europe. Today, it's a global industry. You got Asian players, you've got European players, and you've got domestic players. Solar panels, inverters, basis of systems, and financing. And it's a much broader and competitive market than it was when we first got into it. For us specifically, in 2017, we had outreach from our investment bankers who said that they had someone that wanted to invest in us. And we, in 2016, had just completed 2 rounds of capital raising, and we were set for a few years. So we said, thank you, but no thank you. And they called back the next week and said, well, you may want to take this meeting. It's we've been given permission to tell you who it is. It's Royal Dutch Shell. And so we did take the meeting. They came to Nashville, and we had some very extensive discussions, ultimately led to Reagan and myself going over to The Hague for 3 or 4 days in the summer of 2017, meeting with a large number of their key leaders, including their CEO, to understand why is a big oil company wanting to invest in renewable energy? And is this about greenwashing, or is it about truly trying to grow a company? And what we came to learn, Shell is one of the best companies in the world for scenario planning. They have done unbelievable scenario planning for 25, 50, 75, and 100 years. And at the time it wasn't public, today it is, that they believe that the energy transition is underway and that over the next 50 years, the global economy is going to transition from a fossil fuel base to an electricity based system, and that the future for them is to become a global power company as opposed to a global oil company. And so they were attracted to us to be their US platform for solar development in trying to fulfill that strategy. And so in 2018, we closed the investment, and today they own about 48% of the company.
And looking forward, you have the U.S., renewing its agreement to be part of the climate control agreements, the Paris Agreement, sort of a heightened emphasis in the last few weeks on climate issues and environmental issues. Are you optimistic for your business's future and the future of solar?
I am, and I'm optimistic about the U.S. rejoining the Paris Accords and taking as government policy becoming a more sustainable country. As I think we all know, what's been done over the last 4 years was being driven by the private sector, and it's being driven by companies who want to be sustainable, and so they are making those requirements, whether it's a Facebook, and we're serving Facebook at some of their data centers with renewable generated electricity. Apple, Walmart, Nike, we're working with Nike. The military, I got it under President Obama, the Pentagon was charged with developing a gigawatt of renewable energy per branch. And we've worked with the Navy on helping them fulfill that. As these opportunities drive to both the private sector and now the public sector, I think utilities and others are seeing the benefit of going to the lowest cost of long-term generation that has no harmful impact on the environment. And studies have shown that consumers, especially consumers under the age of 35, make buying decisions in part based on sustainability.
Well, that's fascinating, and I think your career is very interesting. I mean, the combination of government and entrepreneur and seeing the world really from both positions, private and public. Pat, do you have questions?
We do. We have a couple from Facebook Live over via Twitter. Are you seeing any breakthroughs in battery technology on the horizon that will increase the benefit of solar?
Absolutely. That's the next frontier, is being able to take solar generation and make it dispatchable. And there are batteries on the market today for large scale projects. They're not really cost effective yet, but utilities are wanting to start using them on a small scale to understand how they interact with their grid, how the dispatchability of them impacts their transmission system and the like. I believe from the conversations we've had with vendors in the battery technology field that over the next 18 to 36 months, you're going to see dramatic improvements in efficiencies and prices that will allow battery technology to start being deployed more widely as part of solar and wind and other forms of renewable generation. Make that energy more valuable because it's dispatchable when it's needed.
What do you foresee, again from Facebook Live, what do you foresee as the impact of the change in administrations on alternative energy projects?
Well, I think that the government support, just from a policy standpoint, will be meaningful, knowing that we as a country want to become more sustainable, putting emphasis again on clean air and clean water and a healthy environment, will help to drive state and local communities to also create policies. I mean, we deal with zoning at the local level. You deal with tax issues at the local and state level. These are big investments. So helping levels of government see that they play a role in helping to create the environment that allows these investments to occur and these projects to be built will be supported at the federal level. I also think that we'll see utilities who have already migrated. I mean, solar was the largest source of new energy generation last year. and it's going to continue to be that. And as battery technology improves, I think it will only grow in that way. So I think that the combination of the right economics, lowest cost of generation, and good policy has bright opportunities ahead.
Are you seeing your projects displacing any fossil fuel power plants?
Yes, I mean, I think you can see that, for instance, TVA has announced, shutting down some of their older coal plants, and they're replacing some of that generation with solar and some with gas-fired. But TVA has in the last 2 years procured, well over a gigawatt of solar, and that's a huge improvement. Jeff Lyash, their new CEO, is a believer in clean energy, and so I think from what we've been told, I think we can see that they're going to continue to embrace solar, in part because their customers are demanding it. A company like Facebook ain't going to invest in a data center in the valley if they can't get renewable generated electricity. There are other companies who are similarly situated. So I think you'll see a lot more, and it will be displacing fossil fuel.
Last question from our visitors tonight. What types of skills are you looking for to work in your industry?
It takes all types, because for a company like ours, who is a closed loop, I like to say we're sort of the Apple computer of the solar energy industry. We need people who can sell. We need people who can design, people who can build, people who can maintain. And so we have a wide set of skills at our company, from CPAs to lawyers to electrical engineers, civil engineers, all types of engineers. So to accountants and CPAs and the like. So it's we started here in Nashville in 2011 with 2 of us, Reagan and myself. Today we have over 70. I think we're about at 75. We've been adding about 4 or 5 people every couple of months. And I would say that by the end of this year, we'll be well over 100 people in an industry that nobody thought could ever develop in Tennessee, and be headquartered here and employ as many people. And as a result, there's some other companies in our industry that are here. Next Tracker has a service center and fulfillment center. They make the trackers. That's based here in Nashville. Like I said earlier, Shoals in Portland. So there's a nice little set of renewable energy industries here in Middle Tennessee.
Well, good questions all. Thanks for people for turning in their questions for the chairman. Karl, that's it from the peanut gallery.
Well, great. Well, Matt, thank you for taking the time to do this. It was very interesting, and I wish you the best of luck in the future. And again, thanks. Pat, you got final words?
That's it. Just a reminder for our viewers to take a look at the tnwac.org website. We're a nonprofit organization, and we rely on membership and your gifts to keep the organization moving along and bringing programs and excellent guests like Chairman Kisber with you tonight. So look at tnwac.org. Please consider becoming a member or making a gift to the World Affairs Council. And we will be back with Global Nashville in 2 weeks' time. Thank you.
Great.
Everybody have a good night.
Thank you, everyone, and good night.